Matthew Arnold. How is a full and enjoyable life to be lived in a modern industrial society? This was the recurrent topic in the poetry and prose of Matthew Arnold. In his poetry, the question itself is raised. In his prose, some answers are attempted. The misapprehensiveness, wrong-headedness, of his age is exactly what a poet is sent to remedy, wrote Robert Browning, and yet it is to Arnold's work, not Browning's, that the statement seems more applicable. In response to rapid and potentially dislocating social changes, Arnold strove to help his contemporaries achieve a richer intellectual and emotional existence. Matthew Arnold was born in Laleham, a village in the valley of the Thames. It seems appropriate that his childhood was spent near a river, for clear flowing streams were later to appear in his poems as symbols of serenity. At the age of 6, Arnold was moved to Rugby School, where his father, Dr. Thomas Arnold, had become headmaster. As a clergyman, Dr. Arnold was a leader of the Liberal or Broad Church, and hence one of the principal opponents of John Henry Newman. As a headmaster, he became famous as an educational reformer, a teacher who instilled in his pupils an earnest preoccupation with moral and social issues, and also an awareness of the connection between liberal studies and modern life. At Rugby, his eldest son, Matthew, was directly exposed to the powerful force of the father's mind and character. The son's attitude toward this force was a mixture of attraction and repulsion. That he was permanently influenced by his father is evident in his poems and in his writings on religion, education, and politics. But like many sons of clergymen, he made a determined effort in his youth to be different. As a student at Oxford, he behaved like a dandy, elegantly and colorfully dressed, alternately languid or merry in manner. He refused to be serious, and irritated more solemn undergraduate friends and acquaintances with his irreverent jokes. "His manner displeases, from its seeming foppery," wrote Charlotte Bronte after talking with the young man in later years. "The shade of Dr. Arnold," she added, "seemed to me to frown on his young representative." The son of Dr. Arnold thus appeared to have no connection with Rugby School standards of earnestness. Even his studies did not seem to occupy him seriously. By a lesson of cramming, he managed to earn second-class honors in his final examinations, a near disaster that was redeemed by his election to a fellowship at Oriel College. Arnold's biographers usually dismiss his youthful frivolity of spirit as only a temporary pose or mask, but it permanently colored his prose style, brightening his most serious criticism with geniality and wit. For most readers, the jauntiness of his prose is a virtue, though others find it offensive. Anyone suspicious of urbanity and irony would applaud Walt Whitman's sour comment that Arnold is one of the dudes, dandies or city slickers, of literature. A more appropriate estimate of his manner is provided by Arnold's own description of the French writer Charles-Augustin Sainte-Beuve. A critic of measure, not exuberant, of the center, not provincial, with gay and amiable temper, his manner as good as his matter, the critique souriant, smiling critic. Unlike authors such as Alfred Lord Tennyson and Thomas Carlyle, who committed themselves solely to their literary pursuits, Arnold confined his writing and reading to his spare time. In 1847, he took the post of private secretary to Lord Lansdowne, and in 1851, the year of his marriage, he became an inspector of schools, a demanding and time-consuming position that he held for 35 years. Although his work as an inspector may have reduced his output as a writer, it had several advantages. His extensive traveling in England took him to the homes of the more ardently Protestant middle classes, and when he criticized the dullness of middle-class life, as he often did, his scorn was based on intimate knowledge. His position also led to travel on the continent to study the schools of Europe. As a critic of English education, He was thus able to make helpful comparisons and to draw on a stock of fresh ideas. In the same way as his literary criticism, he used his familiarity with French, German, Italian, and classical literatures to talk knowledgeably about the distinctive qualities of English writers. Despite the monotony of much of his work as an inspector, Arnold became convinced of its importance. It contributed to what he regarded as his century's most important need, the development of a satisfactory national system of education. In 1849, Arnold published The Strayed Reveller, his first volume of poetry. 8 years later, as a tribute to his poetic achievement, he was elected to the professorship of poetry at Oxford, a part-time position that he held for 10 years. Later, like Charles Dickens and William Makepeace Thackeray before him, Arnold toured America to make money by lecturing. His lectures could leave audiences indifferent, but sometimes they were highly acclaimed. Thus, the Washington Post reported that, following a 2-hour address in the U.S. Capitol, the African-American leader Frederick Douglass moved that a tremendous vote of thanks be tendered to the speaker. A further inducement for his 2 visits, in 1883 and 1886, was the opportunity of seeing his daughter Lucy, who had married an American. In 1888, Arnold died of a sudden heart attack. Arnold's career as a writer can be roughly divided into 4 periods. In the 1850s, most of his poems appeared. In the 1860s, literary criticism and social criticism. In the 1870s, his religious and educational writings, and in the 1880s, his second set of essays in literary criticism. Today, Arnold is perhaps better known as a writer of prose than as a poet, although individual poems such as Dover Beach, 1867, continue to be widely popular. In his own era, his decision to spend hardly any time composing poetry after 1860 was considered wrong-headed by some. "Tell Matt not to write any more of those prose things like literature and dogma," Tennyson wrote in a letter, wishing that Arnold would instead give us something like his Thyrsis, Scholar Gypsy, or Forsaken Merman. Others have felt that he made the right move. Arnold's poetry has been criticized in both the 19th, 1800s, and the 20th, 1900s, centuries, on numerous grounds. Some have disliked its excessive reliance on italics instead of on meter to emphasize the meaning of a line, while others object to the prosy flatness of certain passages or, conversely, to over-elaborated similes in others. Yet despite these cavils, many readers find much to cherish and admire. Given Arnold's sophistication as a writer, it is perhaps surprising that his evocations of nature function so memorably in his poetry. Rather than simply providing a picturesque backdrop, the setting, seashore or river or mountaintop, draws the poem's meaning together. In this respect, as in many others, Arnold displays a debt to William Wordsworth, whose poetry he greatly admired, but he also draws on his own bond with particular landscapes, especially those associated with his youth and early adulthood. The stanzas of The Scholar Gypsy, 1853, for instance, suffused in a deep familiarity with the changing patterns of the rural scene, from the frail-leafed white anemone and dark bluebells drenched with dews of May to the scarlet poppies and pale pink convolvulus of August, record with sensuous care the distinct seasons of the English countryside and Arnold's nostalgic memories of the rambles of his Oxford days. Arnold's own verdict on the qualities of his poetry is interesting. In an 1869 letter to his mother, he writes, "My poems represent, on the whole, the main movement of mind of the last quarter of a century, and thus they will probably have their day as people become conscious to themselves of what that movement of mind is, and interested in the literary productions which reflect it. It might be fairly urged that I have less poetical sentiment than Tennyson, and less intellectual vigor and abundance than Browning, yet, because I have perhaps more of a fusion of the two than either of them, and have more regularly applied that fusion to the main line of modern development, I am likely enough to have my turn, as they have had theirs. The emphasis in the letter on movement of mind suggests that Arnold's poetry and prose should be studied together. Such an approach can be fruitful, provided that it does not obscure the important difference between Arnold the poet and Arnold the critic. T.S. Eliot once said of his own writings that, in one's prose reflections, one may be legitimately occupied with ideals, whereas in the writing of verse, one can deal only with actuality. Arnold's writings offer a nice verification of Eliot's seeming paradox. As a poet, he usually records his own experiences, his own feelings of loneliness and isolation as a lover, his longing for a serenity that he cannot find, his melancholy sense of the passing of youth. More than for many men, Arnold's 30th birthday was an awe-inspiring landmark after which he felt, he said, 3 parts iced over. Above all, he records his despair in a universe in which humanity's role seemed as incongruous as it was later to seem to Thomas Hardy. In a memorable passage of his Stanzas from the Grande Chartreuse, 1855, he describes himself as wandering between 2 worlds, one dead, the other powerless to be born. And addressing the representatives of a faith that seems to him dead, he cries, "Take me, cowled forms, and fence me round, till I possess my soul again." As a poet, then, like T.S. Eliot and W.H. Auden, Arnold provides a record of a troubled individual in a troubled society. This was actuality as he experienced it, an actuality, like Eliot's and Auden's, representative of his era. As a prose writer, a formulator of ideals, he seeks a different role, to be what Auden calls the healer of a diseased society, or as he himself called Goethe, the physician of the Iron Age. And in this difference, we have a clue to answering the question of why Arnold virtually abandoned the writing of poetry to move into criticism. One reason was his dissatisfaction with the kind of poetry he was writing. In one of his fascinating letters to his friend Arthur Hugh Clow in the 1850s, letters that provide the best insight we have into Arnold's mind and tastes, this note of dissatisfaction is struck. "I am glad you like The Gypsy Scholar, but what does it do for you? Homer animates, Shakespeare animates. In its poor way, I think Sora and Rustum animates. The Gypsy Scholar at best awakens a pleasing melancholy. But this is not what we want." It is evident that early in his career, Arnold had evolved a theory of what poetry should do for its readers, a theory based, in part, on his impression of what classical poetry had achieved. To help make life bearable, poetry, in Arnold's view, must bring joy. As he says in his 1853 preface to his poems, it must inspirit and rejoice the reader, it must convey a charm and infuse delight. Such a demand does not exclude tragic poetry, but does exclude works in which suffering finds no vent in action, in which a continual state of mental distress is prolonged. Of Charlotte Bronte's novel Villette, 1853, he says witheringly, "The writer's mind contains nothing but hunger, rebellion, and rage. No fine writing can hide this thoroughly, and it will be fatal to her in the long run." Judged by such a standard, most 19th century poems, including his own long poem Empedocles on Etna, 1852, were unsatisfactory. And when Arnold tried to write poems that would meet his own requirements, Sora and Rustum, 1853, or Balder Dead, 1855, he felt that something was lacking. By the late 1850s, he thus found himself at a dead end. Turning aside to literary criticism enabled him partially to escape the dilemma. In his prose, his melancholy and morbid personality was subordinated to the resolutely cheerful and purposeful character he had created for himself by an effort of will. Arnold's 2 volumes of Essays in Criticism, 1865, 1888, repeatedly show how authors as different as Marcus Aurelius, Leo Tolstoy, Homer, and Wordsworth provide the virtues he sought in his reading. Among these virtues was plainness of style. Although he could, on occasion, recommend the richness of language of such poets as John Keats or Tennyson, their natural magic, as he called it, Arnold usually preferred literature that was unadorned, and beyond stylistic excellences. The principal virtue he admired as a critic was the quality of high seriousness. In a world in which the role of formal religion appeared to be shrinking, Arnold increasingly emphasized that the poet must be a serious thinker who could offer guidance to his readers. This belief perhaps caused him to undervalue other qualities in literature. In The Study of Poetry, 1880, for instance, he displays little appreciation for Chaucer's humor and chooses instead to castigate him for his lack of high seriousness. In The Function of Criticism at the Present Time, 1864, Arnold makes clear that he regarded good literary criticism, like literature itself, as a potent force in producing what he conceived as a civilized society. From a close study of this essay, one could forecast the third stage of his career, his excursion into the criticism of society that was to culminate in Culture and Anarchy, 1869, and Friendship's Garland, 1871. Arnold's starting point as a critic of society is different from that of Carlyle and John Ruskin. The older prophets attacked the Victorian middle classes on the grounds of their materialism, their selfish indifference to the sufferings of the poor, their immorality and in effect. Arnold argued instead that the Philistines, as he called them, were not so much wicked as ignorant, narrow-minded, and suffering from the dullness of their private lives. This novel analysis was reinforced by Arnold's conviction that the world of the future, both in England and in America, would be a middle-class world and therefore would be dominated by a class inadequately equipped either to lead or to enjoy civilized living. To establish this point, Arnold employed cajolery, satire, and even quotations from current newspapers with considerable effect. He also used memorable catchphrases, such as sweetness and light, that sometimes pose an obstacle to understanding the complexities of his position. His view of civilization, for example, was pared down to a 4-point formula of the 4 powers: conduct, intellect and knowledge, beauty, and social life and manners. Applying this simple formula to a range of civilizations, Arnold had a scale by which to judge the virtues as well as the inadequacies of different countries. When he turned this instrument on his own country, he usually awarded the Victorian middle classes an A in the first category, conduct, but a failing grade in the other 3 categories. Unsurprisingly, he also had pronounced opinions on what he viewed as the distinct national characters of different peoples. A sample of this strain in Arnold's writing appears in the extract from his lectures on the study of Celtic literature, 1867, in Empire and National Identity. Arnold's relentless exposure to middle-class narrow-mindedness in his own country eventually led him into the arena of religious controversy. As a critic of religious institutions, he was arguing, in effect, that just as the middle classes did not know how to lead full lives, neither did they know how to read the Bible intelligently or attend church intelligently. Of the Christian religion, he remarked that there are 2 things that surely must be clear to anybody with eyes in his head. One is that men cannot do without it, the other that they cannot do with it as it is. His 3 full-length studies of the Bible, including Literature and Dogma, 1873, are thus best considered a postscript to his social criticism. The Bible, to Arnold, was a great work of literature like the Odyssey, and the Church of England was a great national institution like Parliament. Both Bible and Church must be preserved not because historical Christianity was credible, but because both, when properly understood, were agents of what he called culture. They contributed to making humanity more civilized. Culture is perhaps Arnold's most familiar catchword, although what he meant by it has sometimes been misunderstood. He used the term to capture the qualities of an open-minded intelligence, as described in The Function of Criticism, a refusal to take things on authority. In this respect, Arnold appears close to T.H. Huxley and J.S. Mill. But the word also connotes a full awareness of humanity's past and a capacity to enjoy the best works of art, literature, history, and philosophy that have come down to us from that past. As a way of viewing life in all its aspects, including the social, political, and religious, culture represents for Arnold the most effective cure for the ills of a sick society. It is his principal prescription. The attempt to define culture brings us to a final aspect of Arnold's career as a critic, his writings on education, in which he sought to make cultural values, as he said, prevail. Most obviously, these writings comprise his reply to Huxley, his admirably reasoned essay Literature and Science, 1882, and his volumes of official reports written as an inspector of schools. Less obviously, they comprise all his prose. At their core is his belief that good education is the crucial need. Arnold was essentially a great teacher. He has the faults of a teacher, a tendency to repeat himself, to lean too hard on formulaic phrases, and he displays something of the lectern manner at times. He also has the great teacher's virtues, in particular the ability to skillfully convey to us the conviction on which all his arguments are based. This conviction is that the humanist tradition of which he is the expositor can enable the individual man or woman to live life more fully and to change the course of society. He believes that a democratic society can thrive only if its citizens become educated in what he saw as the great Western tradition, the best that is known and thought. These values, which some readers find elitist, make Arnold both timely and controversial. Arnold fought for these values with the gloves on, kid gloves, his opponents used to say, and he provided a lively exhibition of footwork that is a pleasure to observe. Yet the gracefulness of the display should not obscure the fact that he lands hard blows squarely on his opponents. Although his lifelong attacks against the inadequacies of Puritanism make Arnold one of the most anti-Victorian figures of his age, behind his attacks is a characteristically Victorian assumption that the Puritan middle classes can be changed, that they are, as we would more clumsily say, educable. In 1852, writing to Clough on the subject of equality, a political objective in which he believed by conviction, if not by instinct, Arnold observed, "I am more and more convinced that the world tends to become more comfortable for the mass, and more uncomfortable for those of any natural gift or distinction. And it is as well perhaps that it should be so, for hitherto the gifted have astonished and delighted the world, but not trained or inspired, or in any real way changed it." Arnold's gifts as a poet and critic enabled him to do both, to delight the world and to change it.